I logged 6 months of being taken for granted. Withdraw every extra favor, present my evidence, collected her apologies, and reclaimed my respect. 6 months of giving everything while receiving nothing in return. 6 months of watching appreciation fade from our marriage like colors bleaching in harsh sunlight. I sat across from her at that expensive restaurant I'd booked weeks in advance, watching her scroll through social media while I talked about our future. That's when I knew something had to change. Let me back up. This wasn't always us. When we first got married 3 years ago, there was mutual respect and appreciation. She would thank me for the little things, taking out the trash, fixing things around the house, planning date nights. And I did the same for her. But gradually something shifted. My efforts became expected rather than appreciated. I remember the first time I noticed it. I had spent an entire weekend renovating our backyard, building a deck she had been wanting for months. I worked through blistering heat, sore muscles, and even a minor injury. When I finally called her out to see the finished project, she glanced at it and said, "It's smaller than I imagined," then walked back inside. No thank you. No recognition of the effort. Nothing. From there, it only got worse. I cooked elaborate dinners, met with complaints about ingredients. I planned surprise weekend getaways, met with sighs about the timing. I supported her career change financially and emotionally, met with expectations for more. The pattern was clear, but I kept trying, thinking maybe the next gesture would break through. I started keeping track after the 4th month, a mental log of all I gave versus the appreciation received. The math didn't add up. 0 gratitude for countless contributions. It wasn't about needing constant praise. It was about the fundamental respect that should exist between partners. The breaking point came when I overheard her on the phone with a friend. "Yeah, he's been acting weird lately, probably feeling guilty about something. He keeps doing all these things around the house and planning trips. I'm just letting him work through whatever it is." I stood frozen in the hallway, a bouquet of her favorite flowers in my hand, listening to her reduce my genuine efforts to suspicious behavior. That night at dinner, watching her completely disconnected from our anniversary celebration, something hardened inside me. I wasn't angry. I was resolved. This wasn't about throwing a tantrum or demanding appreciation. This was about restoring balance and respect to our relationship. I paid the bill while she was in the restroom and sat calmly waiting for her return. When she came back to the table, I looked directly into her eyes for the first time in what felt like months. She must have sensed the shift, because she actually put her phone down. "Is something wrong?" she asked, more annoyed than concerned. "Nothing's wrong," I replied, my voice steady. "I've just made a decision." She raised an eyebrow, waiting for an explanation, but I simply stood up and held her coat. The decision had been made, but the implementation would require strategy, not emotional outbursts. I needed to be calculated, focused, and absolutely unwavering. As we drove home in silence, I mapped out my plan. This wasn't about punishing her or winning some petty battle. This was about reclaiming my self-respect and forcing a long overdue reckoning. If she couldn't see my value willingly, she would certainly notice its absence. The 6-month streak of no appreciation was about to meet its match. And by the time I was finished, those apology letters would be the least of what would change between us. The morning after our anniversary, I initiated the first phase of my plan, direct communication. One last attempt at reason before taking more drastic measures. I found her drinking coffee in the kitchen, already dressed for work. "We need to talk about something important," I said, pouring myself a cup and sitting across from her. No hesitation, no uncertainty in my tone. She glanced up from her phone with that familiar look of mild irritation. "Can it wait? I have a busy day ahead." "No, it can't." My calm refusal to be dismissed caught her attention. For the past 6 months, I've noticed a complete lack of appreciation for anything I contribute to this relationship. I'm not talking about constant praise, but basic respect and acknowledgement. Her expression shifted from surprise to defensive anger in seconds. "Are you seriously keeping score? Relationships aren't about tallying points." "This isn't about points," I countered, maintaining eye contact. "This is about respect. When was the last time you acknowledged something I did for us? For you?" She rolled her eyes. "I didn't realize I needed to applaud every time you did something around the house. That's what partners do. They contribute. Contribution goes both ways. So does appreciation." I laid out specific examples: the deck, the dinners, the support during her career transition. With each example, her defensiveness increased. "So what? You want a medal? A parade?" She pushed back her chair aggressively. Maybe you're doing these things for the wrong reasons. If you need constant validation, I remained seated, perfectly still. I don't need constant validation. I need a partner who doesn't take me for granted. You're being ridiculous, she snapped, gathering her things. Maybe you should think about why you're so needy lately. Not everything is about you. Classic deflection. She wasn't even hearing me. She was trying to reframe my legitimate concern as a character flaw. I recognized the manipulation tactic immediately. This conversation isn't finished, I said as she headed for the door. She paused, her back to me. I don't have time for this right now. We can talk later if you're still upset. The door closed behind her, and I sat alone in the kitchen. I hadn't expected her to immediately see the light, but her complete inability to even consider my perspective told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a communication problem. It was a respect problem. That evening, I tried again. Different approach, same issue. I laid out my concerns without accusation, simply stating facts. Her response was worse than that morning. Maybe I don't praise you because lately there hasn't been much to praise, she said coldly. You're acting like I owe you something. This whole conversation feels like emotional blackmail. That was the final confirmation I needed. Not only was she unwilling to acknowledge the imbalance, but she was actively working to make me question my own perceptions. The gaslighting was clear as day. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable, I replied, my resolve strengthening. But I won't continue to be taken for granted. What does that even mean? She threw her hands up in exasperation. Are you threatening me over not saying thank you enough? Grow up. I didn't respond to the bait. Instead, I nodded once and walked away. She'd made her position clear, and now I would make mine clear through actions rather than words. The next day, I tested the waters. I deliberately didn't do any of the extra things I normally handled. No coffee ready when she woke up. No lunch packed for her workday, no text checking in. Basic courtesy, but nothing beyond the minimum. By evening, she noticed. Is something wrong with your phone? She asked when she got home. There was an edge to her voice. No, why? You didn't text me today. I was busy, I replied simply, mirroring the exact response she'd given me countless times. She stared at me for a moment, clearly connecting the dots. So this is your response? Acting childish because I didn't stroke your ego enough? I met her gaze unflinchingly. I'm simply matching the level of effort and consideration being shown to me. Unbelievable, she muttered, storming off to the bedroom. That night solidified my course of action. The initial confrontation had failed, not because my approach was wrong, but because she was fundamentally unwilling to see her behavior as problematic. Talking was over. Now it was time for the real strategy to begin, the one decision that would ultimately force her to see the truth, even if she didn't want to. As I lay awake beside her sleeping form, I felt no anger, no resentment, just absolute clarity. The 6-month streak of ingratitude was about to meet its match in my unlimited capacity for strategic patience, and she would never see it coming. 2 weeks passed with minimal progress. I maintained a cordial but distant approach, doing only what was necessary to keep the household functioning. She noticed the change but interpreted it as petulance rather than principle. I needed something more impactful, a catalyst that would make my position unmistakably clear. That catalyst arrived in the form of a dinner party with our closest friends. We had planned it weeks ago before my decision. 4 couples gathered around our dining table, enjoying the meal that I had prepared entirely on my own. The conversation flowed, and for a while everything seemed normal. Then Tom, one of our friends, raised his glass. I have to say, this dinner is incredible. You've outdone yourself, man. Before I could respond, my wife jumped in with a laugh. He's been on some kind of cooking spree lately, trying to prove something, I think. The table went momentarily quiet. I felt everyone's eyes shift between us, sensing the underlying tension. Actually, I said calmly, setting down my fork, I just enjoy cooking for people who appreciate it. The implication hung in the air. She glared at me across the table, but I held her gaze without wavering. Well, we certainly appreciate it, Sarah, Tom's wife, said quickly, trying to diffuse the tension. You should give cooking lessons. My wife scoffed. Please don't encourage him. The kitchen is already his personal domain. You should see the mess he leaves. That was a blatant lie. I always cleaned as I cooked, and everyone present knew it from previous gatherings. Her attempt to diminish me in front of our friends was as transparent as it was unnecessary. Interesting perspective, I replied, my voice measured. especially considering I also cleaned the entire house for tonight while you were at the spa." Another uncomfortable silence fell. One of our friends cleared his throat and quickly changed the subject. The rest of the evening continued with superficial conversation, but the damage was done. My wife had shown her true colors to everyone present. As we cleaned up after our guests left, the tension was palpable. I loaded the dishwasher while she aggressively wiped down the counters. "What the hell was that?" she finally demanded, throwing the dishcloth into the sink. "You embarrassed me in front of our friends." "I simply stated facts," I replied. "You were the one who tried to belittle me for no reason." "It was a joke. You've completely lost your sense of humor lately." I turned to face her fully. "No, it wasn't a joke. It was an attempt to diminish what I do because acknowledging it would mean admitting you take me for granted." "This again?" She threw up her hands. "You're obsessed with this appreciation thing. It's becoming pathological. Is it pathological to want basic respect from my wife?" "Respect?" She laughed bitterly. "You want to talk about respect while you humiliate me in our home?" That was the final straw. The complete inversion of reality, painting herself as the victim when she had been the aggressor, crystallized my resolve. "I want you to listen carefully," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "What happened tonight wasn't about humiliation, it was about truth. You've spent 6 months treating me like an appliance, expected to function without recognition. That ends now." She tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. For once, she stopped talking. "I'm not asking anymore. I'm telling you that things are going to change, not through arguments or ultimatums, but through consequences." "What's that supposed to mean?" There was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes for the first time. "It means I'm done overextending myself for someone who doesn't value the effort. Starting tomorrow, you'll see exactly what that looks like." I walked past her, heading upstairs to the guest bedroom where I'd been sleeping since our anniversary. Behind me, I heard her voice, slightly less confident than before. "This is ridiculous. You can't just check out of a marriage because your feelings are hurt." I paused at the foot of the stairs. "I'm not checking out. I'm simply realigning my investment to match the returns." That night, I finalized my plan. I created a detailed document on my laptop cataloging every instance of unappreciated effort and disrespect over the past 6 months, dates, circumstances, exact quotes, all meticulously organized. This wasn't just for her eventual reckoning. It was for my own clarity. Seeing it all laid out confirmed that I wasn't overreacting or misinterpreting the situation. In the morning, I implemented the decision that would ultimately break her 6-month streak. It wasn't complicated or dramatic, but it would prove devastatingly effective. The real power was in its simplicity, complete withdrawal of all extra effort while maintaining absolute control over my emotions and reactions. No more anticipating her needs. No more going above and beyond. No more accepting disrespect without consequence. I would be civil, calm, and completely unmoved by any manipulation tactics. The change began immediately. When she asked where her morning coffee was, I simply replied, "In the cabinet." "The machine's all yours." Her confused expression was just the beginning of what was to come. The first week of my new approach was revealing. I maintained a polite demeanor while completely stopping all the extra things I used to do. No more preparing her favorite breakfast. No more filling her car with gas when it was low. No more handling the bills without discussion. No more planning our social calendar. Each small withdrawal created a ripple effect, exposing just how much I had been carrying in our relationship. By day 3, she was scrambling to keep up with the basic responsibilities that had silently fallen on my shoulders. "The cable bill is past due," she said accusingly, waving the notice at me. "Yes, I saw that," I replied calmly, not looking up from my book. "Well, aren't you going to pay it?" I looked up then, my expression neutral. "Why would I handle that exclusively? It's our shared bill." Her frustration was palpable. "You always take care of the bills." "I used to. Now we're sharing responsibilities more equitably." This pattern repeated with every task I had previously managed without recognition. Her initial reaction was always the same: confusion followed by entitlement, then anger when I maintained my position. By the end of the second week, the physical toll of my decision became evident in our home. Laundry piled up because I only washed my own clothes. The refrigerator emptied because I only bought groceries I needed. The yard began to look neglected because I only maintained the parts I personally used. "What's happening to this place?" she demanded one evening, gesturing around our increasingly chaotic home. "Are you trying to live in squalor to prove some point?" "I'm taking care of my responsibilities," I replied evenly. Everything else is shared territory. This is childish, she snapped. You're deliberately creating problems. I'm not creating anything. I'm simply no longer solving everything unilaterally. Her tactics evolved as she realized this wasn't a temporary tantrum. She tried anger, crying, silent treatment, and eventually reluctant participation in household management. But what she didn't do was acknowledge the fundamental issue, the lack of appreciation that had triggered this entire situation. The third week brought the first serious attempt at manipulation. She invited her mother over for dinner without telling me until the day of, clearly expecting that I would spring into action to avoid embarrassment in front of family. "Mom will be here at 7, she announced casually that morning. "I thought we could have that roast you make so well." I looked at her for a long moment. "That's interesting. What time will you be starting the preparation?" Her smile faltered. "You know I don't know how to make it the way you do." "There are plenty of recipes online," I suggested helpfully. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice rising. "You're going to let me fail in front of my mother to make some point? I'm not letting you do anything. You're an adult making your own choices. You chose to invite someone for dinner without consulting me. Now you're choosing how to handle that commitment." She stormed off, slamming doors and making a show of her outrage, but I remained unmoved. When her mother arrived that evening, she found a hastily ordered takeout meal and a visibly tense daughter. I was pleasant and conversational throughout dinner, while my wife alternated between forced cheerfulness and shooting daggers at me with her eyes. After her mother left, the confrontation I'd been expecting finally arrived. "You humiliated me tonight," she accused, trembling with anger. "No, you put yourself in an untenable position by making assumptions about my involvement," I corrected her. "The humiliation you feel comes from the gap between your expectations and reality. What do I have to do to end this? Whatever this is," she demanded, gesturing frantically between us. For the first time, I heard something different in her voice. Uncertainty mixed with the first hint of genuine concern. She was beginning to realize this wasn't a game or a temporary strategy. This was a fundamental recalibration of our relationship. "It's quite simple," I replied. "Respect has to go both ways. Appreciation has to go both ways. When you're ready to acknowledge that, we can start rebuilding. So I just need to say thank you more often and everything goes back to normal?" Her tone was suspicious, looking for the catch. "No," I said firmly. "You need to genuinely understand why appreciation matters, not just perform it to get what you want." She stared at me, finally recognizing that she couldn't manipulate her way out of this situation. I wasn't asking for performance. I was demanding authentic change. The fourth week marked another shift. She began making small, awkward attempts at appreciation. "Thanks for taking out the trash," she said one morning, the words clearly uncomfortable on her tongue. I nodded acknowledgement but didn't rush to resume my previous level of contribution. One forced thank you wasn't going to undo 6 months of being taken for granted. What she didn't know was that my decision had expanded beyond just withdrawing extra effort. I had begun focusing intensely on myself, hitting the gym regularly, reconnecting with friends I'd neglected, and pursuing projects I'd put on hold. I was rebuilding my identity outside of being her supportive husband, and the results were becoming visible. "You seem different," she commented one evening, watching me get ready to meet some friends. "I am different," I confirmed, not elaborating further. As I headed for the door, I caught her reflection in the mirror. For the first time since this began, she wasn't angry or calculating. She looked worried. The balance of power was shifting and we both knew it, but this wasn't even the main event yet. My true decision, the one that would eventually have her writing those apology letters, was just beginning to take effect. By the 5th week, my wife realized her superficial attempts at appreciation weren't working. I acknowledged her efforts but remained consistent in my approach. This triggered her next strategy, recruiting outside reinforcements. It started with coincidental visits from her friends. They would drop by, engaging me in conversations that inevitably steered toward relationships and how compromise is essential or how everyone expresses appreciation differently. The scripted nature of these interactions was transparent. I remained polite, but unmoved. When one of her friends directly asked, "Don't you think you're being a bit harsh over something so small?" I responded with calm clarity. "Respect isn't small, it's the foundation of any relationship. Would you stay with someone who consistently showed you that your efforts meant nothing to them?" Her friend had no response to that, and the intervention attempts through peers quickly ceased. Next came family pressure. My phone began lighting up with calls from her sister, her mother, even my own brother, whom she'd apparently convinced I was having some kind of breakdown. "She's really worried about you," my brother said during one call. "Says you've been acting strangely, refusing to do things around the house." "Is that what she told you?" I asked, unsurprised by the spin she'd put on the situation. "More or less." "What's going on?" I explained the reality, the 6 months of being taken for granted, the disrespect, my decision to stop overextending myself without appreciation. By the end of our conversation, his tone had shifted. "That actually makes sense," he admitted. "But why not just leave if it's that bad?" "Because leaving is easy," I replied. "Demanding the respect I deserve while staying is harder but ultimately more valuable. Either she rises to the occasion, or I'll have absolute clarity that it's time to move on." The most dramatic escalation came during week 6 when she organized a full-scale intervention. I came home to find our living room filled with concerned faces, her parents, 2 couples from our friend group, and her sister. My wife sat in the center, tissues in hand, looking appropriately distressed. "We're all here because we care about both of you," her father began, clearly designated as the spokesperson. "It seems there's been a serious communication breakdown in your marriage." I set down my keys and surveyed the room calmly. "I appreciate your concern, but there's no communication breakdown. The communication has been perfectly clear. She says you've completely withdrawn, that you're punishing her over minor issues," her mother interjected. "Is that what she told you?" I asked, my voice level. I turned to address the entire room. "Did she mention that for 6 months she hasn't shown the slightest appreciation for anything I've contributed to our relationship? Did she tell you about publicly belittling me in front of friends? Or that this punishment is simply me stopping extraordinary efforts that were never acknowledged?" The uncomfortable shifting in seats told me she had presented a heavily edited version of events. I wasn't angry. In fact, I had anticipated this move. "This isn't about sides," I continued. "It's about basic respect in a marriage. I'm not asking for constant praise, just acknowledgement that my contributions matter." My wife stood up, tears flowing on cue. "I've tried to thank you. I've tried to fix this. Nothing is ever enough." Was the moment I'd been waiting for. I walked to my office and returned with the document I'd been compiling. Not just the original record of disrespect, but a detailed log of her recent manipulation attempts as well. "You've tried?" I asked, holding up the folder. "Let's review your efforts." For the next 20 minutes, I calmly presented specific examples, dates, and direct quotes. Her dismissive responses to my concerns, her attempts to paint me as irrational to friends, the calculated manipulation of family members with false narratives, the performative, empty thank yous that always preceded demands for a return to the status quo. By the time I finished, the room had fallen completely silent. Her father was looking at her with new eyes. Her friends were studiously avoiding eye contact. Even her previously supportive mother appeared uncomfortable. "This isn't an intervention for me," I concluded. "This is an opportunity for everyone to see the full picture rather than the selective version they've been fed." Her sister was the first to stand. "I think you two need to discuss this privately. We shouldn't be here for this." One by one, they made their awkward excuses and departed, leaving us alone in the aftermath. My wife remained seated, mascara streaked down her face, but the tears had stopped. For the first time, I saw something new in her expression, genuine shock. "You've been documenting everything?" she asked, her voice small. "Yes, because my reality was consistently being denied or rewritten. So this was all a setup? Some elaborate scheme to humiliate me in front of everyone?" I shook my head. "No, this was me protecting myself from gaslighting. You arranged this intervention to pressure me into submission. I simply came prepared with facts." "What do you want from me?" she whispered, finally asking the right question. "I want what I've always wanted. A partner who respects me enough to acknowledge my contributions, who doesn't take me for granted, who sees me as an equal, not a resource to be exploited." She was silent for a long time, staring at the folder still in my hands. When she finally looked up, something had changed in her eyes. The manipulation was gone, replaced by what appeared to be the first glimmer of genuine understanding. "I need some time," she said quietly. "Take all the time you need," I replied, setting the folder on the coffee table between us. "The facts aren't going anywhere." She left the house that night to stay with her sister. I expected to feel victorious. I had successfully exposed the truth and dismantled her manipulation attempt. Instead, I felt only a calm certainty that I had done what was necessary to preserve my self-respect. 2 days later, she returned. And what happened next would prove that my decision had accomplished exactly what I intended. When she returned 2 days later, something fundamental had changed. She entered quietly, carrying a small suitcase and an envelope. No dramatic entrance, no tears, no accusations, just a subdued version of the woman I'd been married to for 3 years. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual defensive edge. I nodded, gesturing toward the living room. We sat across from each other, the coffee table between us like neutral territory. She placed the envelope on the table and slid it toward me. "I want you to read this first." I opened it to find several pages of handwritten text, a letter, the first of what would become many. I began reading while she sat silently watching my reactions. "I've spent the last 2 days thinking about everything," the letter began. "At first I was just angry and humiliated, but then I started really looking at the evidence you presented. The dates, the quotes, my behavior. I couldn't deny the pattern once it was laid out so clearly." The letter continued, detailing specific instances where she had taken me for granted, dismissed my efforts, or actively belittled me. She acknowledged each one without excuses or qualifications. The most striking part was her analysis of why she'd behaved this way, not as justification, but as honest self-reflection. "I began to see you as an extension of myself, rather than as your own person," she wrote. "Your contributions became expected rather than appreciated because I stopped seeing them as choices you were making, and started seeing them as obligations you were fulfilling. That was deeply unfair, and I'm truly sorry." When I finished reading, I looked up to find her watching me intently, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "This is thorough," I said carefully, setting the letter down. "It's just the beginning," she replied. "I have a lot more to say, but I wanted to start with a clear acknowledgement of the pattern you identified." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. This wasn't the time for me to speak. "I talked to my sister after everyone left," she went on. "She was brutally honest with me. Said she'd noticed how I treated you but never said anything because she didn't want to overstep. Seeing it all laid out like that forced her to confront it and forced me to listen." She took a deep breath, visibly steeling herself for what came next. "I've been taking advantage of your generosity, your reliability, your love." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "And when you finally stood up for yourself, I tried every manipulation tactic I could think of, rather than simply acknowledging the truth." "Why?" I asked, the first word I'd spoken since she began. "Because admitting it would mean admitting I'd failed as a partner," she said simply. "It was easier to make you the problem than to face my own behavior." There was an authenticity to her words that had been missing from all her previous attempts at reconciliation. No performance, no strategic tears, just uncomfortable honesty. "The letter is a good start," I acknowledged, "but words are easy. What matters is consistent action over time." "I know," she nodded. "That's why I'm not asking you to go back to how things were. I'm asking for a chance to rebuild, starting with balanced expectations and mutual appreciation." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. "I've drafted a plan, equal division of household responsibilities, scheduled times to acknowledge and discuss each other's contributions, regular check-ins about how we're feeling in the relationship." I raised an eyebrow, impressed despite myself. This level of structured commitment was unexpected. "I also think we should consider couples therapy," she added. "Not because we're failing, but because we could use a neutral third party to help us establish healthier patterns." For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of genuine optimism, not because she was saying all the right things, though she was, but because her approach reflected real understanding rather than tactical compliance. "I'm willing to try," I said finally, "but I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't negotiable for me anymore. Respect and appreciation are baseline requirements, not luxuries. If this doesn't work, I'm prepared to walk away." She nodded soberly. "I understand, and you'd be right to do so." The weeks that followed brought a carefully negotiated new normal. The changes were both structural and intrinsic. We established clear boundaries around responsibilities. We implemented regular check-ins about our relationship dynamics. We began therapy sessions that were sometimes uncomfortable but always productive. But the most meaningful change was in the small daily interactions. The first time she genuinely thanked me for handling something, without prompting, without agenda, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Her letters continued, one each week for 6 months, mirroring the 6 months she'd spent taking me for granted. Each one addressed specific patterns or incidents, reflecting on her motivations and outlining her commitment to change. They weren't performative. They were tools for her own accountability and growth. 3 months in, we had our first significant test. A disagreement about vacation plans escalated into frustration on both sides. In the past, this would have triggered her dismissive behavior and my resentment. Instead, I watched her physically stop herself, take a breath, and say, "I'm feeling frustrated. But that doesn't give me the right to dismiss your perspective. Let's figure this out together." That moment, more than any apology letter, showed me that real change was possible. 6 months to the day after I made my decision, we sat down for a formal review of our progress. The relationship we had now barely resembled what had existed before. The balance of power had equalized, the communication had clarified, the appreciation flowed both ways, naturally and consistently. "I have something for you," she said, handing me a final letter. This one was different. Not an apology, but a reflection. She detailed the growth she'd experienced, the patterns she'd identified in herself beyond our relationship, and her commitment to continuing this work, regardless of external validation. "The irony," she wrote near the end, "is that by standing firm and refusing to accept less than you deserved, you gave me the greatest gift possible, the chance to become a better version of myself." As I finished reading, she asked, "Do you regret it, making that decision even when you weren't sure how it would end?" I considered the question carefully. No, it was necessary, not just for us, but for me. I needed to know I could stand up for my own worth regardless of the outcome. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "For what it's worth, I respect you more for it. Not just for standing up to me, but for doing it in a way that offered a path forward rather than just punishment." That night, as we prepared for bed in the main bedroom I had returned to months ago, I reflected on the journey. My decision hadn't been about forcing apology letters or winning some relationship battle. It had been about restoring fundamental respect to our partnership, and it had succeeded beyond my expectations. The letters would remain as a testament to our lowest point and the climb back from it. But the real victory wasn't in those written words. It was in the daily, consistent acknowledgement that we both mattered, that we both contributed, that we both deserved appreciation. Some might call it a small thing, this basic exchange of gratitude and respect. But as I had learned through 6 months of its absence, and 6 months of its restoration, it was actually everything. Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. See you soon.